folks. Well, thank you for coming. Of course, the time that we double book our programming room and we're in the smallest spaces when everyone wants to come hear me. It must be me. So thank you for coming. So my name is Josh Fox. I'm the curator here at the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Civilian Conservation Corps. This past April was the 90th anniversary of the creation of the Emergency Conservation Work Act, which is what the CCC operated under. And in this presentation, I'll kind of give a little overview about the Civilian Conservation Corps, how they lived, and some of the work that they did through the lens of Pennsylvania and using photographs and some objects from the museum collection. We do have, despite the name of just Lumber Museum, we do have a large collection related to the Civilian Conservation Corps, including this cabin that you are sitting in. So, setting the scene, it's the Great Depression. Started at the end of 1929. 1931 to 1933 were considered the worst years of the Depression, with the absolute bottom being the winter of 1932 to 1933. Unemployment was extremely high, reaches 25% in 1933. So breadlines and homeless camps, Hoovervilles, started to spread across the country. And because of all this, Herbert Hoover takes a lot of the blame. People aren't happy with how his government's responding. So Franklin Roosevelt is elected in a landslide in November 1932. And FDR, he has a new deal for the people to help them get through the Depression and to provide relief. So FDR's new deal. So some of the programs focused on the financial side. The Social Security Administration, that was passed in 1935, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, that was passed in 1933. So that was set to help shore up some of the financial end. The FDIC was to help prevent people in case of a bank collapse. That way your deposits were guaranteed by the government up to a certain amount. And then the Social Security will help provide some financial aid to those who were not able to work, whether due to just old age or disabilities, and to help provide some financial relief that way. And then other programs, they were focused to actually putting people to work. And so some of those, and there's a whole bunch of them. There's the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FARA, 1933. Public Works of Art Project, the PWAP, 1933. Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, 1933. Skip the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, 1935. And then the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, 1933. So all these, a lot of TLAs, as we used to, as the bird say, it's three-letter acronyms. All of this was known as kind of referred to as FDR's alphabet soup. All these programs out there that they try to get people to work, and a lot of them you can still see the legacies today. Obviously, Social Security and FDIC are still active programs, but even some of the work programs, such as the work from the WPA or the TVA, you can see a lot of what they built today, and that goes especially so for the Civilian Conservation Corps. So, the Emergency Conservation Work Act of 1933. So, on March 31st, Congress passed the Emergency Conservation Work Act of 1933, and on April 5th, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6101, appointing Robert Fleschner as the Director of Emergency Conservation Work. And so this was happening in March. Don't forget, back in the 1930s, the inauguration wasn't until March. So this is one of FDR's first acts and first programs to go through once he became president. So the Civilian Conservation Corps, that name was in use from the beginning. However, the official name of the program of the act was the Emergency Conservation Work. So as such, a lot of the CCC camps, you might see them referred to as ECW camps, and a lot of the CCC work would have been referred to as ECW. That changed in 1937. The program then officially became the Civilian Conservation. So by April 17th, the first CCC camp, NF1, Camp Roosevelt, was established in George Washington National Forest in Virginia. And then just 1 week later, on April 24th, the second CCC camp, ANF1, Camp Landers, was opened in Pennsylvania's Allegheny National Forest. So Pennsylvania is right there from the beginning. The second CCC camp was opened in Pennsylvania. And so this picture we have is Franklin Roosevelt visiting a CCC camp, and to his left is Director Fletcher. So the need for conservation in Pennsylvania and beyond across the country. So the logging industry had turned Penn's Woods into the Pennsylvania desert through the practice of clear-cut logging that had been taking place in the late 19th into the early 20th century. Pennsylvania went from an estimated 95% forest at the time when William Penn would have arrived, down to 30%. So there's a drastic reduction in the forest in this state. Now, and by the 1930s, the logging industry, the major industry for the most part, had moved on from Pennsylvania. What they could clear cut and if they wanted, they had pretty much cut by that point. And the industry had moved on to other states, such as Michigan, or they've always were in Maine. They moved down to Louisiana or Pacific Northwest in California. So most major logging had kind of moved out of the area by then, but the damage had remained. You still would have seen, a lot of barren hills and clear-cut land, and a lot of the CCC camps were located near former lumber towns. A couple of notable ones not too far from here would have been Latonia and Maston, both of which were pretty sizable lumber mill towns, by which point the industry, the mills had moved out, and the CCC camps were basically the last thing in both of those towns. And once the CCC left, those towns basically became ghost towns. So it says that it's a national-wide program. Clear-cut logging was not limited to Pennsylvania. And another big conservation problem at the time had to do with soil erosion. And especially in the plain states in the early 1930s, soil erosion through farming practices had led to the Dust Bowl. So big problem of soil erosion in the plain states. But erosion, again, wasn't just limited to the plain states. It was a national problem too. And to solve this, the Soil Conservation Service, or the SCS, another acronym, was formed in 1933 to combat erosion nationwide. And the SCS would go on to operate 500 CCC camps across the country, including camps in Pennsylvania. So soil erosion was a problem here too. Now, it might have been different for different reasons. So obviously, farming practices, but then the clear-cut logging contributed to soil erosion, because without the trees, you didn't have the root systems to hold the soil in place. So there was a lot of soil erosion in Pennsylvania too. So the SCS operated, I believe, 13 camps in Pennsylvania. This photo here is some clear-cut logging. It's from our collection. It's showing this skidding the logs down. And this is from the Drake family collection, which came to the museum recently in 2001. So the CCC comes to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was pretty ideally suited for the CCC for several reasons. First of all, we needed the help for the mentioned reasons I had just gone over. We need help with reforestation due to the logging industry. And Pennsylvania at this time owned about 2 million acres of state-owned land as well as some federal land. And this was a big leg up for Pennsylvania. Even in the 1930s, the concept of state-owned forests and state-owned parks was still relatively new. And Pennsylvania was one of the first states to really get into this, starting in the late 1890s. Early 1900s, Pennsylvania started to get a lot of forest land from the loggers. The logging companies, once they were done with the land, a lot of times they stopped paying taxes on it, so the state was able just to seize the land, or they bought it cheap, because once the logging concerns were done with it, the land wasn't worth anything to them. They were happy to sell it to the state for anything that they could get. So this Pennsylvania had land that they could then offer the CCC to use, because the CCC for the most part wasn't to operate on private land, because it was a federally funded project and was supposed to operate on public land. Now there were some exceptions to that, but that's for the most part. And in addition to state-owned land, we had a cadre of professional foresters. When Pennsylvania started getting this land, they realized that, we needed trained foresters to take care of it. Starting in 1903, the Mount Alto Academy was opened in southeast Pennsylvania to train state foresters. So we had our own staff of people who knew how to do the work and who could supervise men doing the work. Basically, to use the term, Pennsylvania had a lot of shovel-ready jobs for the CCC. And our governor in 1933 was Gifford Pinchot. This man sitting with FDR, who is probably most famous for being the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service under Teddy Roosevelt in 1905. And he also served as the chief for the Pennsylvania Department of Forest and Waters. So needless to say, this man was more than willing to accept conservation help and was a pretty enthusiastic supporter of the CCC, because he was one of America's first professional foresters. So he fully embraced the project. Even despite the fact that he was a Republican and FDR was a Democrat, he was more than willing to embrace the CCC. So then, bringing that back, the first Pennsylvania camp opened in Allegheny National Forest just 1 week after the first camp. First. Oops. So your CCC enrollees, who joined up? Your typical CCC enrollee, they were male. So this was for men only. U.S. citizens, 18 to 25. They were unemployed, unmarried, and they were from a family that qualified for assistance. Part of that was for the pay. So they enlisted for 6-month terms, up to 2 years, and they worked 5 days a week. And they received $30 a month pay, which is about $675 today, and 25 of that was sent directly to their family. So this was a relief program not just for these men, but for their family, and that's why that $25 went straight back to their family to help support them too. So they were allowed to keep $5 a month, which is about $113, which though isn't too bad, because as we'll see, they had a place to live. They had 3 meals a day, which was a big deal. A lot of these guys did not have 3 meals a day before they were signed up, and they were given clothing and any of the necessities that they would have needed. So that $5 was really theirs to either just save or to spend as they will. So not too bad. We have here a photograph, it's a panoramic photograph of the men of Camp S77 North Bend in 1933, which came to the museum last year. So this is one of the newer additions as well to the collection. So your CCC camps. The camps were operated by the U.S. Army. Now there was a big stress that these men were civilians. They were not enlisting in the Army. It's right in the name, the Civilian Conservation Corps. But if you need someone who can move a lot of men, house a lot of men, feed a lot of men, the Army knows how to do that. Why reinvent the wheel? And they frankly needed the work too. So Army officers were placed in charge of camps. They were called up from the reserves, so this was a way to get more military personnel to have jobs and paying jobs too, as well, to be in active service. So a camps housed one company, and companies were composed of 200 men. So generally, a camp had 4 barracks. And looking at this map, this is on S35 Dyer Farm. So you can see these buildings would have been the barracks. And then there's a mess hall. So that's why there's 5 of them. The 5th one is probably the mess hall. There would have been an infirmary, bathhouse, shower house, a rec hall, which would have included classroom space as well, officers' quarters, headquarters, and there's been a tool shop and a motor pool to keep all the vehicles. So that's what a camp generally consisted of. The men often would have slept in tents until the camp was built, because when they showed up, it would have been not even an empty field. A lot of times they would have had to clear it themselves, and then they built. The first thing you would have done at a new camp is built a camp. And the Army supplies were used. Again, that's part of putting the Army in charge. And early on, a lot of this was World War I surplus. Waste not, want not. A lot of stuff from World War I was still sitting in warehouses. They probably expected World War I to go on a lot longer than it did. So we had a lot of extra gear just sitting around. So a lot of what CCC men had to work with was World War I surplus. Another aspect was African Americans in the civilian, in the CCC. The Conservation Corps was segregated. This is due in part to the Army policy. The Army at the time was segregated, and also due in part to demands from Southern politicians. In order to get their support, FDR had to promise that the Civilian Conservation Corps would be a segregated operation. So these colored companies, which were known as CCCs, were set up and operated the same as white companies. There were no necessarily just color camps or white camps. They would often rotate camps, just obviously not at the same time, but they were in separate camps. So white officers were placed in charge of the camps. Black officers were not in charge. The CCCs, however, did receive equal pay and benefits. The camps tended to be located in more remote areas or on federal land. This was kind of out of a fear that the local populations might not like having them located nearby. So if they were in more rural areas or if they were on federal land, the hope was that it would lessen some pushback from the locals. So the first CCC camp in Pennsylvania was ANF 5 Sugar Run, which was opened by Company 321C in 1933. And from where we are sitting, where the museum is, that the closest camp to us would have been the Bark Shanty Camp in Austin. There are also veterans companies with the CCC. So this came about because in 1932, the Bonus Army, which comprised of World War I veterans, marched on DC to demand early payment on bonuses that they were promised from their World War I service. This did not end too well. They set up a Hooverville in DC, encampment, a shanty town. And on July 28, 1932, Army troops under General MacArthur forcibly cleared these men out of the camp that they had set up. And the optics of this was obviously pretty bad. President Hoover, got a lot of blame for this. And a lot of people there's the thought that a lot of this really led to the dislike of Hoover that led to him losing the election such that he did. Then after FDR became president, a second bonus army marched on D.C. the next year in May of 1933. It's a little bit smaller. FDR still would not pay their bonus, but he did offer to raise the age and marriage requirements to give World War I veterans a spot in the CCC. So, for the most part, to join the CCC, you had to be 18 to 25 and unmarried. Now there's the exception. If you were a veteran, you could still join the CCC as well. And these were organized in separate CCC-V companies. So these men were in their own camps too. They would not have mixed with the younger enrollees. And so we can see here, this is a reproduction of a CCC patch, a CCC-V Veterans Company patch. And then these two men are from Camp S-113 Reedsville. So in the top of the photo, it's a little hard to see, but it says 10th Cavalry up there. So that was written on this photograph when we received it. And just going by this, the 10th Cavalry was one of the original Buffalo Soldier units in the U.S. Army. So these two men were probably with the 10th Cavalry during World War I. That was where they earned their veterans status, what they served with. And so they were at Camp S-113 Reedsville in the CCC. So there are different types of CCC camps. If there weren't enough letters and acronyms, here's a few more. So they had different designations depending on the main project or who was overseeing their work. So most camps in Pennsylvania were S. So as I was saying, S-113 Reedsville. So that's state forest. So that would be most of the camps in Pennsylvania. Then there was also SP for state or local park. There's SCS, as mentioned, the Soil Conservation Corps. NP, National Park Service. MP was military park. So the Gettysburg camps were originally MP camps because historic battlefields were operated under the War Department until 1936 when they were transferred to the National Park Service. So at that time, Gettysburg camps went from MP camps to NP camps. A couple other MP camps in the state would include where Hopewell Furnace is located. The men of the CCC camp there developed the Hopewell Furnace Historic Site, as well as working down in Laurel Hill and several other National Recreation Demonstration Areas, which was a project that the National Park put on to build kind of model parks to show the public that they can get out and recreate in the parks. So there's also A&F, which I've mentioned a few times, stands for Allegheny National Forest. P, private forest. So I said for the most part, you couldn't do this on private land, but there were some exceptions for large privately owned forests that still needed either soil erosion control or needed other work. So there was a P for private forest, and then there's A for Army and AM for Armed Forces. A lot of this times this worked out to depots, supply depots for the CCC, or there were some training grounds. New Cumberland had a lot of training for the CCC men where they could go and receive specialized training for like mess steward or other more specialized training. So this photo is from CCC Camp MP5, Rookwood, and it was originally SP8, Camp SP8. So I can get a little confused. And so this was a National Recreation Demonstration Area, which is now Laurel Hill State Park. The National Park Service transferred these areas to the state after World War II. And these buildings are still there. Laurel Hill has probably the largest, one of the largest collection of existing CCC built structures in the country. And so not only the cabins and the ranger stations that were built, but also the camps survived and were used as group campgrounds. So like if the Y or the Boy Scouts wanted to rent something and you were down in Laurel Hill, you could have stayed in the barracks of the CCC. And that's pretty rare. For the most part, most of these camps were torn down when they were done. Either they were relocated or they were just taken away. So if you want to see what the camps actually look like, you can head down to Laurel Hill, down in southwest Pennsylvania, and you can see the original CCC camps down there. So the work that was done by these men, there was all sorts of work done, and just mostly, obviously, doing conservation work. These men would plant trees, they would develop forest trails, forest roads, and they would do forest fire fighting work and park development projects. So starting over here, we have some forest work. These two men are from Camp S87, Ole Bowl. Up center at the top, that was a work crew that worked out of S114 Tea Springs, which is near Loganton. And at the bottom is a bridge that was built by the men of S114. These are two photos of recent additions to the collection from George Huff, and came in last year. And another recent collection is at the end. The man in the front swinging the sledgehammer as part of the work crew is Evan Evans. He was of Camp S77 North Bend. And so these men are working, developing a road, going to make those big rocks into smaller rocks with their sledgehammers. And that kind of can illustrate a point. The CCC were instructed to not buy equipment that would make work necessarily go faster. If work could be done by 10 men, but you could buy a machine that then made it so 2 men could do it, you let the 10 men do it. The whole point was to put people to work. So that's why these guys are out with their sledgehammers, making these big rocks into smaller rocks. And some more work, as I said, park development was a big part of the CCC. So there is a detailed work detail. These men were going to Harrison Park. So Leonard Harrison Park on the Grand Canyon was developed by the CCC men. These men were from Camp S135 Dixie Run. And we have a park shelter here. Now this photograph is just labeled park. I don't know which park, though chances are pretty good it's also Leonard Harrison, because this came from a gentleman, Mr. McCarthy, who was at S155 Darling Run, which is right below Leonard Harrison in the Grand Canyon. So they would have worked on that park as well. So it could be Leonard Harrison or Colton Point. And then these men on the end at the Rob Horse Trail, which is a trail in Susquehannock State Forest. And they are from S135 Dyer Farm. It's from the Cornish collection. So the men of S135, they also would have built this cabin. This cabin was not a cabin that the men would have lived in. They had their barracks. This was built to be a rental cabin. If you go to a state park, you can rent a cabin. And this would have been one of those cabins. Now this cabin was built to be part of the Black Forest State Park. If you haven't heard of it, it's because they never finished it. For whatever reason, the Black Forest State Park never came to be, but they had still built the cabins, and it's still part of the state forest. So these cabins, instead of being vacation rentals, became long-term hunting leases. And so this was leased out as a hunting cabin. And then in the 1980s, the lease was up, and DCNR wanted improvements to be made to renew the lease. The lease owners didn't want to do that, so this cabin was slated to be demolished, and instead it was saved and brought here to the museum. So that was this cabin, but there were still other cabins at the same location that are still around today, that are still being leased out as hunting cabins. So, why was it important that they built roads? Because this is the roads that were in existence. This little example of getting stuck in the mud. I have quite a few photos in the collection that show that that was not an uncommon occurrence. And then over on the right, you can see that this was a year-round job. These men are all bundled up to work in the winter. So the stock truck is from the Dyer Farm camp. This winter crew is from S87 Ole Bull. And then down here, one of the big things that happened in 1936 for the men in the CCC camps around here was the major flooding in Williamsport and Lock Haven and around those areas. So these men from S66 Loganton, they responded to help with the cleanup after the flood efforts. And men from many camps in the area responded to that, and these men happen to be from the Loganton camp. And just a little bit about this. The photo is from the Colonel Campbell collection. Colonel Campbell, at the time, was Captain Campbell, and he was the superintendent of several camps in the area. So he was in charge of S66 Loganton, but then he went on to be in charge of a couple of the African American camps. The photographs showed before from 146 Bar Shanty and 113 Reedsville are also from the Colonel Campbell collection, just illustrating how it was white officers in charge of colored camps. Just a little side note for Colonel Campbell. After he was done with the CCC, he remained on active duty, and he was at Wheeler Field in Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. Then this last picture from Ole Bull. If the men were out working in the field, they got lunch brought to them. It was supposed to be a hot lunch if possible. So the mess crew was to load up and bring meals out to the crew. As I said, if it was supposed to be hot lunch, they were supposed to get a hot lunch. Now, if they were really working out in a remote area, they could brown bag it. But these guys, the chow line, and they're getting ready to receive their lunch. A little bit more about the winter work. One of the uniforms in our collection. You have the overcoat and the wool pants and hat. So a little close-up of the men from S87 doing their work out in the winter. And here they are opening the highway. So these guys from the camp even ended up taking, I guess one equipment exception was made for this bulldozer, and they used it to plow paths in the roads around here. So again, year-round operation. You didn't get days off because it was a little chilly. So some more examples of CCC uniforms. So for the most part, the CCC relied on Army surplus, especially at the beginning, leftover World War I uniforms. They didn't get their own uniform until 1939, when this spruce green dress uniform was introduced. So this would have only been issued from 1939 until 1942, when the program ended. And the men in Pennsylvania, the 3rd Corps, which Pennsylvania was a part of, were the first to get these uniforms. So here we have Gerald Starks from the Barchani camp. He is in his new dress green uniform. And here is the logo of the CCC. It was located on the garrison cap. You can see it on the camp here. And another thing of note, the stripes on both of these uniforms. So they were civilians. They didn't have Army rank. but there were some ranks in the CCC, and one of those would have been the rank of leader. So these stripes denoted that these men held the rank of leader. So it would have been someone who was probably on at least their second enrollment in the CCC and would have been in charge of work details and the like. And then we have the denim work fatigues, which are a pretty common issue. Our statue out front, that gentleman appears to have work fatigues on too, except he took his top off, so it's a little hard to tell, but he definitely had the Daisy May hat, as in this enrollee from Ole Ball, also sports. So he is wearing the original 1919 model, which was a polo. And that got updated. That would have been what they wore for most of the time, but they got updated in 1940 for a complete button down because the pullover is pretty inconvenient. And I think that's why a lot of the pictures, the men basically just took them right off because it wasn't the most comfortable thing to work with. So they did get a little update right before the end of the program with the model 1940 work fatigues, as well as those shoes are also 1940 models as well. Camp life, so it wasn't all work. So the men lived in barracks. So here's an example photo of the barrack at the bunkhouse at Dyer Farm from Cornish collection. And you can see the men, this is probably about a bunk's worth of men posed for their group photograph. We have a color collection of colorized photograph of S77 North Bend. This is shot down what was known as the company street. We've been in the main walkway of the camp. And we have a camp sign. Nice little, some individualizing touches meant to pride in how the camps worked. And that's S87 Ole Bull. More photographs around camp. Another company street, this one S89 Comrade. And note how nice it was. If there was nothing else to be done, there was always work to be done on the company street. So these are nice painted white rocks and everything's meticulous. Don't worry, there was something to be done. You have the motor pool from S114 Key Springs. You see some of the vehicles down there for the company that the men were loaded up to go out for the day. Row barracks and some men from Dyer Farm, or the Cornish collection. And some men building their camp at S81 Slate Run. That's from the Bowen collection. If you do go look in their temporary gallery, feature photographs from Merrill Bowen. This is Merrill without his shirt on. And an interesting thing about Merrill is that he is of the Seneca Nation. So he's a Native American. And the CCC did have a separate Indian division. These operated a lot on reservations out west. These were just for Native Americans, and they didn't necessarily have camps. Those guys could live at home and just go and work but still be in the CCC. But that was for reservations. Pennsylvania doesn't have any reservations. So Merrill, he was allowed just to join a regular CCC camp. So he was not forced to be in one of the segregated camps. He joined one of the regular CCC companies. Chow time, meals are always very important, especially if you're working all day. You need some good food in you. Mess hall is probably one of the main hubs of a camp. So we have kitchen crew from Darling Run. Hopefully the cat did not end up on the menu. They did make an effort to have special meals for Thanksgiving and Christmas. So this is the Thanksgiving menu from the New Cumberland Reception Center. Enrollee working in the kitchen at one of the camps at S133 Hammersley Fort. We have a photo of the mess hall at 114 Tea Springs. And another, the mess crew from Melbourne collection of S81 slate route. The menu plan was set up by the mess steward, and the mess officers, they had some discretion. They could buy their own food. It wasn't coming straight from, necessarily straight from the depot. They did have some discretion, so they could have some local items on there. Again, a lot of it was to get money out into the local economy too. You could buy from local farmers and the like, or you could buy from Kellogg's. And Kellogg's quickly picked up on this and sent representatives out to camps. They provided this menu plan, which is going to be a little hard to read, but this menu plan helpfully suggests such things as Kellogg's Corn Flakes and Kellogg's Raisin Bran and Kellogg's Pep. So, yeah, it was very nice of Kellogg's to help out with that. And so a lot of the items that we have related to food, kitchen mess, come from one gentleman from James Lane. So this is his apron and his kitchen, his mess white trousers. You can see that on display, as well as this menu. He was a mess steward at the S88 Lyman Run, which was the Gaelton camp. And a lot of that stuff we have does come from him. He was in pretty much towards the very end of the CCC. And fortunately for us, it looks like he got a new issue of uniforms and then left before he ever actually really wore them. So we have some nice uniforms in our collection. Education was to be a big component of camp life in the CCC. Now, when you were done the workday, it was your own time. But one of the ways that you could spend that time was to further education. Now, they offered things such as, courses to help complete high school. Not everyone was fully literate at this time, so they helped some enrollees, develop those skills, but also more technical job training skills as well, too. So you can learn a lot of, hopefully job skills to get you a job after the time in the CCC. So here's an enrollee at volleyball. Looks like he's studying. I'm not quite sure. The photo wasn't labeled, but he looks like he's studying. This photograph from Bark Shanty shows the white officers on the corner, but also the chaplain with the campaign hat, and then this gentleman here was Mr. Davis. He was the education advisor. So chaplain and education advisor were two leadership positions in a camp that were open to African Americans. So Mr. Davis would have been in charge of the educational programming at his camp. And here we have the Lyman Run Ripples. It was the newsletter or the camp newspaper. This one was from Lyman Run, S88, the Gaelton camp. Pretty much every camp would have had their own newspaper newsletter, and that was part of the educational programming. They would have had some journalism classes or poetry class, and the poetry would have been featured in there. Or if there was a drawing class, you could feature your artwork in there. So really, it was a way to highlight a lot of the educational programming that was going in camp, as well as the comings and goings of camp itself. So it wasn't all work. There was some play too. They said that a rec hall was the standard part of a camp. So here is the rec hall of S131 Castella. These men were able to get pool tables, so they had a nice little setup going there. Below, organized sports were part of it. This is the baseball team from the Dyer Farm camp. They also could have had football, or we have photographs of men engaged in boxing matches. So sports was a big activity. And you could leave camp on occasion. Here we have a program from the second annual dance, basketball, entertainment for S93 Laurel Run. But it was held at the East Stroudsburg Armory, so we've been held in town. And you could have maybe met some of the local gals for the dance. That was another popular activity. If you weren't close enough to your town, especially on the weekends, you were free to go. You didn't have to stay in camp. You didn't need special leave. You can go into town and maybe try to meet some of the local leaders. And if you wanted to take them to the theater or get them something at the sweet shop, these are two ads from the Lyman Run Ripple showing things at what's playing at the Main Street Theater that week or the coming month, and advertising trying to get you to go to the sweet shop maybe before or after. And souvenirs. You need to remember your time at the CCC. That extra $5, maybe it was burning a little hole in your pocket. You could have shopped at the camp commissary. So this man here, he's hanging out at the commissary at S135 Dyer Farm. And you could buy things like candy, some sodas, or some of these souvenirs. Profits would have been gone back into the camp and maybe help buy some of the recreational equipment that you would have seen. I believe it's a little hard to tell, but from what I can tell, this box right here is Baby Ruths. I don't know what the other ones are, but I could at least tell that there's some Baby Ruths or so. So you can get your Baby Ruths. And I guess if you could buy, they had coupon books that you could buy for the exchange to use that as well. So here's the coupon book from Lyman Run. And said you could buy, there were companies that made objects for commemorate CCC service. So this patch and this pennant were pretty generic, and you would have your specific company stamped on to personalize it to your company. And then this book here, this is a historical history. It's kind of a comic book highlighting CCC life, but also included spaces for autographs for people to write down names and addresses of the men they served with to take home and remember if there's anyone you wanted to keep in touch with. Which kind of brings us to the end of the CCC. So by the late 30s, the economy was doing a little bit better. So a lot of men, if you get a full-time paying job, probably paid you more than that $5 a month that went in your pocket at the CCC. So a lot of guys were just opting to do that. And then also the war clouds were on the horizon too. And that kind of led a little bit into a slight shift in the tone. Before, I mentioned there was a stress of the CCC being a civilian operation with no military influence. That changed a little. The men started to receive a little more military training. And the education program took a little bit more of a national defense flavor. This certificate is the National Defense Training Program for radio assembly. So that obviously has some military applications that Warrior Clifford here completed as part of his CCC training. So a little starting ramping up of the war effort, that being mindful that we would probably end up in the war sooner or later. I like this newsletter from Oli Bowl News, kind of highlights the confusion that these men were feeling at the time. This is from June 1940. So still a good year before we entered the war, but the war was going on. These guys had a type of uniform on, so they weren't quite sure what was going to become of them. And then, so once we did enter the war, the CCC, their funding was allowed to lapse. So in June 31st, 1942, which was just the end of the fiscal year, the funding for the CCC ended. Now at that point, there were only 4 camps operating in Pennsylvania anyway. So said they kind of saw that the program had been kind of dwindling down anyway. It was harder to get enrollees. So there were only 4 camps still operating at the state when it did finally cease operation in 1942. The CCC men, if they did sign up for active military, they went in as sergeants. So their CCC service did count to get them in as in a higher rank. And this gentleman here, Max Kahlenberg is there because after the CCC camps closed during the war, some of them were used as POW camps. So Max here, he was a German soldier. He was captured and he was here at the Gelton, at the Lyman Run POW camp, which was formerly Camp S88 of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And what Max and some of his fellow prisoners did is they would be used to work in the forest, and they cut down trees for the chemical wood factory, probably the one in Roulette, and so that they were able to help the chemical factory keep operating during the war, because they lost a lot of the men to go fight the war, so they used these POWs to kind of fill in the gaps. And that's really the last use of a lot of the CCC camps. They either pretty quickly disappeared after that, but while the camps may have disappeared, you can still see a lot of the work that was done by the men of the CCC. You can visit the state parks that they built, the trails that they blazed, just a lot of the work that they've done can be seen in how we get out in our forests and how we experience our parks and forests today. So from 1933 to 42, there were approximately 200,000, little less than, Pennsylvania men who served in the CCC. Only New York had more men sign up, and Pennsylvania was home to about 152 CCC camps, not all at one time, which was second only to California. So that just shows how much the CCC had an effect in Pennsylvania and how much Pennsylvania embraced the work that they did. Nationwide, the CCC had approximately 2.5 million men put to work in over 4,500 camps in all 48 states, at the time 48, as well as Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So this was a program that really was a national effort, and again, it's not just Pennsylvania where you can see their legacy, you can see it all across the country. And that's it. So thank you for listening, and if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer. And if not, by all means, check out the exhibit in the main building. We do have the permanent exhibit about the CCC, but then also a new exhibit in our temporary gallery highlighting some of the recent additions to the collection and other stories that aren't normally told for the 90th anniversary of the Civilian Conservation. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very good.